The morning light through the diner windows should have felt warm, but for Jaxson, it was cold and heavy. He sat in his wheelchair, adjusted to the familiar ache in his lower back, trying to maintain a peaceful expression while a stranger loomed over him. The man, a thick-necked bully with a sneer that seemed etched into his face, didn't see a human being. He saw an easy target. "See, you can't bust tables in a wheelchair. You're gonna make a mess," the bully mocked, his voice echoing off the linoleum floor. He leaned in, his breath smelling of stale coffee, and began a tirade that questioned Jackson's very existence, calling him a disgrace and accusing him of leeching off the government's money. Jaxson didn't blink. He had faced down warlords, but this social cruelty was a different kind of combat. The bully, frustrated by Jackson's silence, grabbed a thick, chilled strawberry milkshake from a nearby tray. With a slow, sadistic tilt of his wrist, he poured the pink sludge directly over Jackson's head. It coated his hair, ran down his neck, and soaked into his veteran's jacket. The room went silent, save for the rhythmic drip, drip, drip of the milkshake hitting the floor. Jaxson reached for a thin paper napkin, his movements deliberate and calm despite the sticky pink liquid stinging his eyes. He wasn't looking at the bully. His eyes were locked on Maya, his teenage daughter, who sat across from him with her face buried in her hands. He wanted to reach out, to tell her it didn't matter, but he knew that to a 15-year-old, the world was ending in this diner booth. "Could I get you anything else, sweetie? Maybe some pie?" he asked, his voice steady as he tried to salvage the wreckage of their Friday lunch. He mentioned catching a movie at 6, a desperate attempt to bridge the canyon that had grown between them since he returned from his last deployment. But Maya wouldn't budge. She looked up, her eyes red with a mixture of anger and profound embarrassment. Every time he tried to offer a kind word or a small treat, she pushed back harder, her silence more painful than the bully's insults. She wasn't just ashamed of the milkshake, she was ashamed of the man sitting in the chair. Jaxson realized that his training had prepared him for everything except the cold rejection of his own child. He watched her pick at her food, realizing that no matter how many miles he had traveled to protect her, he was currently failing the most important mission of his life, being her father. The air in the booth was suffocating, thick with years of unspoken resentment. Maya finally broke the silence, her voice a sharp, jagged edge. She told him she was sick of going out in public with him, that the stares and the pity were too much to bear. When Jaxson tried to gently remind her that he was still the same man who had raised her, Maya's facade crumbled into pure vitriol. She told him that nothing was the same since he came back blown up. To her, his service wasn't a badge of honor, it was an act of abandonment. She accused him of caring more about people halfway across the world than his own family. "My entire life was turned upside down," she hissed, her voice trembling. She compared him to her mother, who she claimed had stayed and done everything right while he was away playing hero. Jaxson listened as she picked apart his sacrifice, realizing that his physical injuries were nothing compared to the emotional shrapnel he had brought home to his family. He saw the loser she saw, not a warrior, but a broken man who had traded his legs and his daughter's childhood for a war she didn't understand. The bully, emboldened by the lack of retaliation and the obvious rift between father and daughter, decided to twist the knife one last time. He stood by the counter, laughing with a few other patrons, making sure his voice carried back to their booth. "Don't forget to wipe the floor if you can. You missed a spot," he called out, gesturing to the pink puddle surrounding Jackson's wheels. Maya's face burned a deeper red, her shoulders hunching as if she could disappear into the vinyl seat. Jaxson simply signaled the waitress for a rag, his dignity intact, but his heart heavy. He began to wipe the floor himself, the awkward angle from the chair making him look even more vulnerable to those watching. The bully's insults continued, attacking Jackson's status as a war hero and calling him a disgrace to the uniform he no longer wore. Every laugh from the bully was a blow to Maya's pride, and she looked at her father with a coldness that suggested she agreed with the man who had just humiliated him. Jaxson continued to clean, his hands steady, his mind retreating to a place of tactical focus just to survive the emotional onslaught. The bells above the diner door jingled, but it wasn't the sound of a new customer. It was the sound of a nightmare. A man wearing a dark hood and a frantic expression burst inside, a heavy iron clutched in his shaking hand. "Give me your wallets! Get on the ground now!" he screamed, his voice cracking with a dangerous mix of adrenaline and fear. The casual atmosphere of the diner evaporated instantly, replaced by the sharp metallic scent of terror. Patrons screamed, chairs scraped against the floor, and the waitress dropped a tray of glasses that shattered like ice. The robber moved with jerky, unpredictable motions, waving the gun toward the booths. Maya froze, her breath hitching in her chest as the reality of the situation crashed down on her. The bully, who had been so loud moments ago, was now cowering under a table, his bravado vanished. The robber began pacing, shoving a bag toward people and demanding they fill it with their valuables. Jaxson didn't move to the floor. He couldn't. Instead, he sat perfectly still, his eyes narrowing as he transitioned from a disgraced father back into the elite operator he was trained to be. While the room was a symphony of sobbing and panicked whispers, Jackson's world became silent and sharp. His heart rate didn't spike. It leveled out. He began his assessment with the cold precision of a machine. He looked at the robber's stance, unbalanced, feet too close together. He looked at the grip on the weapon, too tight, white-knuckled, indicating a lack of professional training. He identified the firearm immediately, a Colt .45. He watched the way the man held the bag and the gun simultaneously, noting the tactical error of putting a high-caliber handgun inside a paper sack. "You should be careful with that. You're going to hurt yourself," Jaxson said, his voice cutting through the panic with an eerie, flat authority. The robber spun around, startled by the lack of fear in the man in the wheelchair. Jaxson began to speak not as a victim, but as an instructor, pointing out the lack of fingerprints and the danger of gunpowder residue. He was already several steps ahead, calculating the distance, the timing, and the psychological state of the man behind the mask. The robber's eyes darted around, his panic mounting as Jaxson refused to show the expected terror. "Dude, what's your deal? Shut up!" the gunman yelled, his weapon trembling as he pointed it at Jackson's chest. When Jaxson continued to speak calmly about the technicalities of the Colt .45, the robber's frustration boiled over. He looked for a way to regain control, his gaze landing on the terrified girl in the booth. "Is that your daughter? I'm gonna put a bullet in her first," he snarled, stepping toward Maya and leveling the gun at her head. The air in the diner seemed to freeze. Maya let out a small, broken sob, her eyes wide as she looked at the barrel of the gun. In that moment, Jackson's calm exterior didn't break, but his internal focus sharpened into a lethal point. "You don't point that gun at my daughter," he said, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a weight that made the robber hesitate for a fraction of a second. The stakes were no longer about money or pride. They were about the life of the only person Jaxson truly loved, and he knew he had only one chance to save her. Jaxson leaned forward slightly, his eyes never leaving the robber's. "Putting your gun in a bag like that, it's smart in a way," he said, his tone almost conversational. He explained with a chilling level of detail that the Colt .45 was a powerful weapon, and if the robber fired it through the paper, the heat and muzzle flash would cause the bag to burst into flames instantly. The robber's eyes flickered down to the bag in his hand, a look of genuine doubt crossing his face. It was the only opening Jaxson needed. With a speed that seemed impossible for a man in a wheelchair, Jaxson lunged. He grabbed the robber's wrist, twisting it with a sickening pop that forced the gun to point toward the floor. Before the man could react, Jaxson used his upper body strength to pull the robber off balance and drive him into the side of the booth. The gun clattered to the floor and Jaxson was on him, his arms locking the man into a submission hold that rendered him helpless. "Weapon secure! Call 911!" Jaxson barked, his voice filled with the command of a man who had led teams into hell and back. The diner was silent for a long, ringing moment after the struggle ended. The robber lay pinned under Jackson's powerful grip, groaning as the adrenaline faded and the pain in his arm took over. The waitress, her hands shaking, finally reached for the phone to call the police, her voice breaking as she gave the address. Patrons began to emerge from under tables, looking at the man in the wheelchair with a mixture of shock and profound gratitude. The bully was among the last to stand, his face pale and his eyes averted, unable to look at the man he had just mocked. When the police arrived, they found Jaxson perfectly calm, his hands still securing the suspect as he gave a concise, tactical briefing to the responding officers. He didn't look for praise. He didn't look for the cameras. He only looked at Maya. As the officers led the robber away in handcuffs, the diner began to buzz with the realization that they had just witnessed a masterclass in courage. The milkshake was still drying on Jackson's jacket, but no one was laughing now. Maya was still in the booth, her body racked with tremors that she couldn't control. Jaxson moved his chair toward her, his face softening as the warrior mask fell away. "How are you holding up, sweetie?" he asked gently. Maya looked at him, and for the first time in years, she didn't see the wheelchair or the disability. She saw her father. She threw her arms around his neck, sobbing into his stained shoulder. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I've been such a jerk to you," she cried, her voice muffled by his jacket. She admitted that she had been so focused on her own anger about his injury that she had forgotten how lucky she was that he had come home at all. She realized that his strength hadn't stayed on the battlefield. It was right there in his heart, and it had just saved her life. Jaxson held her tight, his eyes moist as he whispered that it was okay, that he would always be there for her. As they eventually left the diner, the rift between them hadn't just been patched, it had been forged into something stronger through fire and milkshakes.